All right. Good morning, everyone. All right. Well, we have a fun set of topics today. Over the next 3 lectures, we're going to talk about systems thinking, strategic planning, and strategy implementation. And all 3 of these topics are very interconnected. So systems thinking is really about understanding elements of an organization and the component parts of an organization. Strategic planning is going to be about how you can develop plans to make sure that organizations continue to thrive and be successful and achieve their mission and vision. And then strategy integration is going to be a little bit about how can you make sure that strategic plans can be successfully implemented within an organization. And that ties immediately back to systems thinking, because at the end of the day, a large organization is a system. So all 3 of these topics are very, very related. So for the first hour, we're going to talk about systems thinking, and we're going to explore what is a system, what is systems thinking. We're going to talk a lot, and I really want to hear from you all on this. In what ways are healthcare organizations systems? How do they act like a system? What are some of the challenges to systems thinking? And then we're going to put systems thinking into action. So, what is a system? A system is any group of interacting, interrelated, or interdependent parts that form a complex and unified whole that has a specific purpose. Raise your hand if you do not think you work in a system. Good. Okay. We all work in a system. Frankly, I think we all live in a system. Our household is a system. So I want to hear from you all. Raise your hand. Just describe ways in which the organization or hospital you work in is a system. And do all the parts of the system, do they all work perfectly together?
For sure not. Perfection does not exist. Yes, because they are interconnected. When one part does not work well, it affects the whole system.
Yep.
And even the result.
That's a great point. One part of a system, if it doesn't work well, it can have ripple effects. It can impact other parts of the system.
So we make an example with our teams. Imagine a car. If you put not qualitative motoring, so the car is not going so well, and even dangers of the atmosphere. So it's the same with the hospital system. If you have not so good resources,
Yep.
or one process is not doing so well, you can even damage.
Absolutely. A lot of head nodding there. One more. Any other ways in which a health system or a hospital acts like a system? Yes.
Yeah, because these units, departments, functions to support one another. Mm-hmm. If one is not working well, it will negatively affect the performance of the other. And it's like a chain. One is waiting for the output of another to utilize the output and also perform its function, and the outcome of the second function is being awaited by another to also function. Like in my unit, we are operating imaging equipment, and we are depending on electricity and energy for our machines to work, and surgeons and physicians are waiting for the interpretation results from our department to take clinical decision to treat patients. And those patients are also, and the pharmacy is waiting for the doctors to prescribe medicine, and then the chain is like that.
Yep.
So I think everybody depends on the other to also everybody is waiting for the leadership to provide the resources, and those patients and those staff need to be paid salary, and their families are so everybody is dependent on another.
Absolutely. And it's no coincidence, right, that like we all work in health systems in the States, right? We work in a health system. I would say that healthcare, hospitals are some of the most complicated systems that anybody can work in, for many of the reasons that you both just laid out. So we just talked about this a little bit. So what is systems thinking? We're going to talk the rest of the time about systems thinking. How can we navigate a system to ultimately help the system, help the organization advance its mission in the most effective way possible? So systems thinking is a way of seeing and talking about reality with awareness of how various components of the system interrelate and impact each other. So you both just spoke eloquently about acknowledging that there's different functions and they each do different things and they're all interdependent upon one another. Not everybody thinks like that, so awareness is half the battle, but then awareness is not enough. We also have to think about, well, how do we navigate within this complex system that we're aware of? And so systems thinking is, while systems thinking is acknowledging that there's component parts and they interrelate with one another, the opposite of systems thinking is siloed thinking. Does that word translate, silo? It's like if I work in Department A, that's all I care about. I don't care about what's going on in Department C or Department B. So I just think about my own little world, and I'm not thinking about the world around me. What are some examples of siloed thinking? And I'm interested, can anyone give a real world example of a time where within your hospital or your organization, somebody was exercising siloed thinking and it had a negative impact? Yes.
Well, actually, this is, happened during the time of the peak of the waves of COVID. It happens afterwards, like separate clinics which are in the campus. They are on their own separate organizations in jurisdictional and financial terms. But still, we make a system. So gastroenterology and pulmonology clinics, so there are two separate entities. But if the ministry says, hey, today we are donating the CT scan, and everybody is going, I'm going to take it, or one entity says, I need space. Okay, we're going to take that space from that other clinic. So everybody's thinking only about their entity, without being aware and thinking that it can damage the other one, which constitute a part of a larger system. So working as a silos and not being aware that they're in a system from which the citizens of that city or state benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great example. I'll give two more examples. One is a healthcare one, one's not a healthcare one. So, patient comes into the emergency department, and the first doctor comes in, right? And he's looking at his vision, and the vision's not good. He says, all right, we need to get this person an eye exam. Second doctor comes in, he notices that the patient's arm is a little funky and says, we need to get this man to an x-ray. He broke his arm probably. Third doctor comes in later, looks at the patient. He's stumbling around. This guy's drunk. We need to go put him in the drunk tank for a while. Finally, the fourth doctor comes in and says, looks at the vision, looks at the arm, looks at the stumbling. This man is having a stroke, right? The first 3 doctors were operating in their individual silos, and the 4th doctor was thinking systematically, looked at the whole system. Another example, non-healthcare. So we can all remember the financial crisis of 2008, and there were banks in my country and other countries as well who were just looking at that short-term profit motive, right? At the end of the year, for me to get my bonus, I need to sell as many mortgage-backed securities as I can. And so they were operating within their single incentive structure and not caring about the system. In this case, the system was both their own bank's balance sheet as well as the whole economic system that we were all impacted by. They were thinking about the short term and without thinking about the long term, and we all suffered for it, right? So a part of effective systems thinking is also making sure that incentives, whether they're in your department, on your team, within the organization, are all aligned for that broader mission. So we're going to talk about, as I said, strategic thinking a lot more later today, but I do want to quickly draw the contrast between strategic thinking and systems thinking. So as we're going to talk about later, strategic thinking is to think about the what. So what does our organization need to do in order to achieve its mission? And why is that mission so important? Why, at the end of the day, will the mission add value, either to us as an organization or to our clients or customers? Systems thinking is the how, right? So we have a plan. We have a vision for our hospital. We know that our mission is to care for every patient that walks into the door. But then how effectively are we going to do that as a system? Systems thinking and understanding the components and some of the key principles will help us in achieving the what. So I just talked about this actually. So the banking crisis example is a really good example of one of the challenges that are posed that can get in the way of systems thinking. So in many organizations, there is a tension that's always ongoing between short-term objectives and longer-term goals, right? So in the banking example, the short-term objectives that many of the bankers had was, if I sell 20 securities this month, no matter how bad they are, no matter how faulty they are, I'm going to get my bonus. But then what happened? The banks were way over leveraged and the whole institution collapsed. And so the short-term incentives were not aligned with the longer-term goals of the organization. A paramount long-term goal of an organization is we actually want to be around next year, right? We still want to be an organization next year. So these short-term incentives really undermine that core goal of, hey, we still actually want to be in business next year. Can anyone share any examples of this short-term tension versus long-term, this tension between short-term objectives and long-term goals within their own work life, within their own system? Yes.
Patients that are being attended by specialists. So he wanted to incentivize the specialists to remain after hours instead of most of them going to a private clinic. to remain at the hospital and attend to these patients. So what he did, he said, okay, all the patients who, if specialists are attending patients who are insured, I will increase the amount of pay per patient that you see. So that increased the number of patients that were attended by specialists, and the hospital gained from this. But unfortunately, those patients who are not insured, out of pocket, and mostly they are poor, they were not being attended by specialists. So it brought out this problem, and patients started complaining that are not properly attended.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm going to have an example later, not in healthcare, but it's similar to that.
Yeah, I have an example that's ongoing for, I don't know, several decades in our countries, and that's the challenge of education of young surgical residents, which need to spend more and more hours doing surgery versus the short-term objectives to do more surgery per day. If the resident is doing more surgeries per day, it would take longer time and they could do less surgeries. So that's the constant battle between the education, the young residents, which will take more hours and less surgeries per day, versus more surgery and better or outcomes for the patients.
So the tension there is we have, and the same thing in my hospital, you actually have two missions, right? At least two. One is to educate, but the other is to care for people, and the more people you care for, the more money you make. And so there's a constant tension between education and volume. I see a lot of head nodding, so I think a lot of people are experiencing that. How do your systems navigate that? Is it just something we live with and it is what it is? Anyone have any examples or experiences of where your organization maybe found a healthy balance or a way to navigate that tension? Mine hasn't either, so it's still, it's just the reality of doing business, right? Okay. So now we're getting a little bit into the practical application of understanding systems and how we can start to change the system and operate more, hopefully, effectively within a system. So I like to think of this triangle as like an iceberg, right? So that line between patterns and system structures, we all in our day-to-day professional life see everything above that line. We see patterns happening and we see events happening. Everyone know what a pattern is? Pattern is the repeat of the same thing happening over and over again. And events are just, right, discrete things that happen to us every day. And the overwhelming bulk of our day-to-day, right, Monday and Tuesday, for a lot of us, the Monday I had at work is like almost exactly the same as the Tuesday I had at work, right? Because work is a repetition of events, the same thing, and patterns. Those events happen over and over again. So the way the tension you mentioned around this constant struggle between education and surgery, the pattern might be, potentially, that every day you hear surgeons complaining that they have to be doing, meaning this educational mission potentially, at the expense of their own pocketbook. Maybe. Some surgeons are probably not voicing that opinion because they're very mission academically oriented. They're more academically oriented, but the ones that really want to, have a million surgeries every day, you might see that complaint happening every day. and those complaints every day are a pattern, the result of a systemic structure. So in this case, the systemic structure is we have a healthcare system where education and clinical application are interrelated, and there's this tension because of the system that has been created. Do you ever ask yourself at work, why does this thing keep on happening? This thing that's a challenge every single day for me, why is it happening? Or do you just kind of tend to go with the flow and just deal with it?
Sometimes there is so much nonsense in our settings that you just become overloaded and you just become indifferent, right? Because the amount of nonsense is like
Yeah?
unbearable. There is no like system at all, I believe sometimes. You just random events happening all the time.
Yeah? Yes?
Our organization, we applied the principle of 5 whys. So when an event happens, all of the participants come together to put 5, to apply this 5 whys
Huh?
instrument to go to the root of this event, and frequently it is in our system. So we are focusing to change systems, not just to think how to go tomorrow without this event. So we should think for the future, not such kind of unfortunate events not to happen. And we started to apply these mechanisms of 5 whys even when we're designing or redesigning, reorganizing the process. If something is not working well, just before to reorganize it, let's think why it is not working well, and we provide education for 5 whys for all of managerial team, just to think in one direction.
That's great. What are the 5 whys?
What?
What are the 5 whys? Did you say 5 whys?
5 whys. Why it is happened? Because. But why this because happened? So if you put, for example, we have an near-miss event of applying the wrong medicine for a patient.
Mhm.
Why it near-miss happened?
Yeah?
Because nurse didn't have correct instruction. Why nurse didn't have correct instruction? Because doctor didn't wrote. Why doctor didn't wrote? And this is a simple example, but we applied this 5 whys even all the processes.
Great, thank you. Does that
Just
take
to,
a...
to go to the root of
Yeah.
the event or a process.
Yes?
If the question was why events happens, it just happens because it's inevitable. It will happen anyway, whether you want it or no. And the question why it happens again and again is just the ship has to go, and there is not enough time for managers to stop and think.
Yep.
And in order to prevent it to happen, you have to modify something. But as I observe it, every day it happens again and again for years. And what I'm thinking that my manager they're just not aware of the system that you have to modify the system. You cannot,
Yeah?
and they work day and day again and again with the consequences, and it continues for years.
Yep. All 3 of you hit on, I think, 2 really big obstacles to systems thinking and making change. One is just the time. Who has time to do it, right? And then, the gentleman's no longer here, but just like problem overload. There's so many problems, my organization included. Like, how do you even begin to tackle one problem, right? And again, that also is very related to time, because if there's 10 problems, it's going to take 10 times longer, right? So it's a challenge. So, how do we start to go from working in a system where to some extent we may feel like, well, we want to throw our hands up and just develop these workarounds to just deal with the patterns and not try to address what's actually driving the patterns? How can we go from that mentality to let's try to fix the system? Let's just not work in the system, but let's fix it. I would say that this is probably one of the most important parts of being an effective manager and an effective leader. Effective managers and leaders, they start operating not in the space of patterns and events, but they start operating below the surface at that more foundational piece of the iceberg. So let's talk about, in a little bit more detail, a model that can help us think about changing a system. So we've talked about patterns and events. And patterns and events are different levels within this 5-level model. Each level has an associated action mode, right? So for events, we're all reactive to the event. The event happens and we react to it, right? When a pattern happens, we adapt to the pattern. We develop a workaround or a way to manage that thing that keeps happening over and over again. But oftentimes that workaround might not be the most efficient way to do it, but we've adapted over time just to survive, right, the pattern that keeps happening. Can anyone talk about like a workaround that they may have developed on their own just to get through the day and overcome or respond to a pattern that kept happening over and over again? Evan, I might actually call you out because I remember you told me about an interesting workaround with when the 2 different Epic systems at the beginning were not in your department, were not connected, and the teams developed an interesting workaround. Inpatient, outpatient, yeah.
Yeah, so there were issues, if I remember correctly, that we installed Epic as our electronic health record, and just different ways in which Epic is built as well as just our installation. It turned out that you had what were called login contexts, and so if you were logged in taking care of inpatients or logged in taking care of outpatients, you actually couldn't see across the record. But the whole point was to be able to see the longitudinal care for patients. So a primary care doctor could log in and had limited access to what was going on the inpatient side. And so there were some workarounds created in order to handle that until we could sort of streamline the system to get to the whole goal of having a unified electronic health record. And I mean, one of the other things about that comes up here is that sometimes these things are so they're so obvious that almost people don't even talk about them. And you actually have to, and people are like, wait a second, you can't see what I see? I mean, it never even occurred to me, right? And sometimes, I don't know whether I've shared that my wife is a primary care doctor, and I actually don't remember if that's how I realized this. Because I would say to her, some patients you can take care of in the primary care office, I'm taking care of them in the hospital. She's like, I can't see what is going on in the hospital. It's like, so it's a little weird, right? Like, people shouldn't have to be married to figure out if there's a problem with the electronic health record. But, right, so, anyway, so we find these systems all the time, and you do have to dig to find what the workarounds are. I think there's another one, Brendan, I don't know if I ever shared with you, like our admission process. In the emergency department, everything was electronic.
That's the one I was thinking about.
And in the admission office, everything was electronic. But getting from the ED system to the electronic system, there was a fax machine in between. So in the emergency department, they thought they were doing everything electronically. But it turned out, right, there was this machine in the way that could break, run out of toner, get jammed up, or just a piece of paper could slip off, or people didn't see it. So it turned out the systems weren't as connected as we thought they were, and you have to do some deep sort of design work and have people walk through a process. And you know, there's the 5 whys, but there's also just like, okay, tell me, what exactly are you doing, and how do you do it, and where does this information show up, and when does it show up? And you can uncover some of these issues and realize that you've got these disconnects.
Thank you, Evan. That's a perfect example, too, of siloed thinking. And sometimes just not talking about that next department where you hand off to, you're not talking with them, how are you going to figure out what their systems are, what their processes are, and understand the impact of those systems and models and processes on your patient's care and on your own just work life. Did those 2 examples resonate with people? Yeah. So like I said, effective managers and effective leaders work at a higher level of thinking about vision and thinking about mental models that can start to reconstruct the existing systems. And we're going to talk about those 2 elements in more detail. So we're going to talk about vision later too as part of strategic thinking. But and this seems pretty foundational, but it goes to one of the 5 whys, which is it's really helpful sometimes to take a step back and say, what is it we're actually trying to do here, right? It sounds simple, but I do it all the time. How often do I just go into work mode, just start reacting, and then 2 hours later, I feel like, I don't think I'm being very productive. Let me take a time out. What is it I'm actually trying to do? So having a vision for what you're doing is absolutely essential to be able to reconstruct, break down, and rebuild a system in a way that meets the goals and objectives of your organization. And this goes back to communication. It's not enough for you to just have a vision on your own. You need to make sure that everyone within your system, everyone that you're interacting with, either within the course of a day or within the course of a week or a year, are all kind of aligned to what is the thing we're getting up every day to do. What is our goal? What is our objective? So it's simple in a lot of ways, but we oftentimes forget to ask ourselves, what are we doing and why? And that's step 1. And then here is a more, nuanced and complicated part. So once you have clear alignment on a vision, before you can actually develop a new optimal system, you want to do some mental modeling. Does everyone, raise your hand if you want to take a stab at what a mental model is. So a mental model is really just a person's thought process about how something works in the real world. How does this thing actually work? So Evan just gave a great example of how people in the ED thought that they were entering everything, the information, into an electronic system that was electronically in real time beaming to their colleagues on the floor, on the inpatient floor. So they developed their own mental model that was wrong, right? So mental modeling is really the process through which structures can be broken apart and put back together. And so there's often power in just first asking, this pattern I keep seeing, let me take a step back. Let me chart out all of the components that happen throughout the day that are related to this particular problem. How are all these pieces working? And it takes time, but similar to visioning, you should not do it alone. And in fact, you can't do it alone, because even though we don't want to practice siloed thinking, which we talked about earlier today, to some extent we do work in silos. We only work in our department. So in order to really understand how the whole process works, to build out that mental model of A to B to C to D, I actually have to go out and talk to other people, right, within my organization, but in different departments, to really understand what is going on. And so the key, like I said, is to invite others into the process to develop a mental model. So here is, I think, a really great concrete example of how you can do mental modeling. And it really can be as simple as getting out a piece of paper. Get out a piece of paper, identify all of the different functions that you think are involved in the particular process. So in this example, we'll use patient care in a clinic. So figure out what are all the touch points that a patient has to go through between the minute they realize that they have a health issue to the minute that they are discharged from the clinic, and maybe even beyond, depending on what the particular problem is you're looking to solve for. So feedback loops are a really helpful way to think about mental modeling. So at the top diagram here, this is a linear view. This is, I think, how most of us experience our world on a day-to-day basis, whether it's professionally or personally. So we may live in stage B there, in the linear view. And we may or may not know what happens in A, right? We may know what happens at the stage right before we take the patient. And we may know what happens in C right after we hand the patient off to another function. But sometimes we don't know what happens in D and beyond. And so if you're stuck in that linear mindset, you're not looking more broadly to understand how the broader system is operating. So in a feedback loop diagram, again, if we're in B, we can start to see that the world doesn't necessarily operate in a linear way, and there may be multiple variables that are impacting me. So it's not necessarily just C, but you can see that we draw a line arrow back from D to B, and if you invite more people into your thinking, you have a better chance of understanding that there's other variables at play, there's other things happening here that are affecting my world that I don't necessarily see on a day-to-day basis. But if I step back, invite the right people in, and simply write out how are things working, I can start to see things in a new way. So let's use a real-world example. So let's just say there's a company, and the company is making, I don't know, shoes, a shoe company. So they have a pattern that keeps happening over and over again. And the pattern is sales, whenever sales are down, they always respond the same way. Sales are down, we need to increase our marketing to get sales back up. And it works every time. Every time, the more they spend on marketing, the more shoes they sell. And so the orders increase. And the top, this is the linear way of thinking, by the way. Orders increase. When orders increase, obviously, then that means sales are up. And when sales are up, then every time there's a backlog. And they can't handle, right, there's a backlog. And then every time after there's a backlog, sales go down. And when sales go down, what do? They repeat the same pattern. Marketing promotions go up. And in a linear way of thinking, you can see how the company can just get stuck in the pattern of repetition. Right? This thing happens, I do this thing, a good thing happens, but ultimately then a bad thing happens, I'm putting it in very simple terms. And so I keep doing that thing again to get back to the good. And so maybe in that situation, there could be a lot of things at play here. What are one of the things that could be happening within the system that leads to this linear way of thinking? We've talked about a few of them already within the context of our own hospitals and organizations. Yeah?
Maybe there are some people who are benefiting when things are going like that. Okay? With backlogs, maybe the marketing department is benefiting from that. Maybe they get incentivized by increasing promotion or whatever.
Yeah?
So there are some people who are probably benefiting by status quo.
Absolutely. Another element of that is maybe the CEO of the company used to be in marketing, right? Maybe he was the chief marketing officer and then he became chief executive officer, and so all he does is has a marketing mindset. Thinking about DISC and the birds, I mean, it could be as simple as the chief marketing officer could be the eagle in the room, the loudest voice at the table. And so every time there's sales are down, maybe there's some doves in the room or owls that say, this keeps happening, maybe, especially the owls, right? The owls are probably saying, let's chart this out, let's do a process map, let's figure out what's happening. But maybe the eagle in the room is marketing focused, and so thing keeps repeating. So at the bottom is what is taking this very same problem, this very same pattern, and just drawing it in a different way. And it's a nuance, but it's an important nuance. By putting the orders in the middle of the diagram, and then asking, okay, orders can do more than one thing. They can increase and they can decrease. Let me start there and let me kind of work back from that to understand what are the things that happen next, both before and after, and think about for each variable, how does one variable connect to more than one variable, right? So in a linear view, basically, I'm saying there's only one variable that happens before, one after, and I just think in a straight line. Here, I'm really opening up my mind and thinking more about, could one variable have impact on multiple variables, not just the next one? And you can see how visualizing it in this way really helps make the connection that, oh, wow, when orders increase and decrease, there's a direct relationship to backlog, and then whenever there's a backlog, orders are decreasing. Now, it seems like a nuance, right? Because isn't sales being down the same thing as like orders decreasing? Yes and no, right? Because sales being down could tell you, if you were just focused on sales, it could tell you that, it could lead you to a conclusion that maybe my competition is just doing better marketing. And then I'm getting back into that like marketing mindset of this might be a marketing problem. But if I reframe it to say orders are going down, it may not necessarily be a demand problem anymore. It could actually be something that I am doing internally within my organization, my organization is doing internally that may be preventing all of the demand from being met. And so just that simple reframing, just that simple nuance, really understanding all the component parts might lead to that aha moment of, we don't actually have a sales problem, we don't have a demand problem, we have a capacity problem. And that's exactly what this company was suffering from. They did not have the capacity to meet all of the orders that were coming in. So, does this make sense? Do people see how just thinking about things a little differently, taking a step back, understanding all of the different variables can be helpful? Yeah, yep.
I think that this is, I'm noticing right now that this is very complex, because you, as a part of a system, it's like I imagine, as I'm the kidney of the body, but maybe I can generate a change as a leader, but we have to notice that as a part of a system, you put in one of the slides that if we only improve one part of the system, that is not maybe be reflected in all the organization.
Yeah.
Maybe we can, if we improve only on the part where we could be affecting other parts of the system,
Yeah.
maybe in a bad way.
Yeah.
For example, no?
Yeah.
That we have to think that there are things under us, beside us, and over us, and then maybe we can influence all these parts of the systems, but where that change has to be generated, because maybe I can influence the organization and maybe I can influence my director. But as part of the health system, he also has to change, to generate a human change.
Yeah.
Over. So it's really complex to be in thinking in systems and thinking in the strategic situation where we have to generate the change.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm really convinced after this seminar that I will able to generate change, but where to begin?
Where to be? Yeah. That's a great question. Did everyone hear that? Where do you begin, right? And then the other thing that we discussed, you just rightfully pointed out, is I can make a change in my own function, my own part of the system, and I think it's a good change, but there's risk in change, right? It may have unintended consequences in another part of the system that maybe I didn't recognize, right? Or maybe I recognized it, but no matter how much I tried to involve everybody in the system and communicate what I was doing, someone down the line didn't get that email that we were changing, and I actually caused more harm than good. So, I don't know, my answer would be, there's always risk in change. That's just the nature of change. And so you bring up an incredible point. Whenever you're gonna think about changing in a system, you have to do the best that you can to think about what are all of the potential consequences, what are all of the maybe unintended consequences that can happen from change. And while and we're going to talk about this in strategic planning. There's no such thing as a perfect plan, right? There's no such thing as being perfect. And so one of the most important ways to mitigate against those unintended consequences is that idea of bringing in all of the stakeholders that you think are a part of the system to make sure that their voice is at the table. Because if you're working in function or department B, no matter how smart you are, there's no way you know about everything that's going on in department C. So you need to bring in that stakeholder from C. And so doing what I would call a stakeholder mapping to really understand who are all the people I need to bring in is a really important part of the process. And I think another point to bring up here is systems thinking can happen for small problems and big problems, right? So what I don't want you all to take away from this is there is no way in heck I can change my entire hospital system. Are you kidding me? Like, how am I going to do that? Well, what about something that you see that's not working squarely within your department that may be totally independent of other departments? And that is maybe a challenge that you can start with, and that's more manageable. Because you're right, if you want to fundamentally change the why of your system. So let's say this would be like the most macro change I can think of within the system potentially. If right now you work for an academic medical center, and for whatever reason you think that your medical center should only be focused on research, that is probably maybe the biggest possible change you could make. You're changing the why. You're changing the total, like why this organization even exists. Can you imagine all of the stakeholder engagement you would have to do to make that change? You could do it. It would take a long time. But what about if I see everyone coming in late every morning to my department? That could be a manageable change that I can start with, because there may not be variables in other parts of the department. There may be something very concrete happening within my department that I can start to change. So I would say 2 elements to mitigate risk would be make sure you really have a clear-eyed view of all of the different variables and departments and functions and people being impacted, and making sure each of those departments have a seat at the table when you're trying to change the process. And then the other part is sometimes starting smaller is better than starting bigger. Is that helpful? It's not a perfect answer, but there's always risk in change. Well, we are at the end. Any questions, comments, anything you don't agree with? Yes?